Welcome to the Industry Experts panel at PortfolioWealthGlobal.com. My name is Michelle Holliday. Today we are welcoming a very special guest for the first time here at Portfolio Wealth Global, Mr. Karl Denninger. Karl is the former CEO of MCS Net. He is the author behind the market ticker. Karl received the 2008 Reed Irvine Accuracy and Media Award for his grassroots journalism for his coverage of the 2008 market meltdown. Karl is an American technology businessman, a finance blogger, and a political activist, sometimes referred to as a founding member of the Tea Party movement. If you are new to PortfolioWealthGlobal.com, our founder, Tom Beck, always reports amazing reports for our audience. He creates them. They are free and fully downloadable, incredible information. Today, in anticipation of Karl coming on our show, Tom actually reviewed the latest of our exclusive free reports, such as the PortfolioWealthGlobal.com/bonds, PortfolioWealthGlobal.com/crash, PortfolioWealthGlobal.com/portfolio, also PortfolioWealthGlobal.com/gold playbook, and our latest PortfolioWealthGlobal.com/mineral. Tom did this to compile the most important questions for today's investors to hear Karl's perspective. Karl, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great down here in Florida. It's a beautiful day today.
Oh, beautiful weather, right? Unlike the Northeast.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons I don't live up there.
Winter will not let go. Well, Karl, we want to start off with our first question. It's a fundamental question, and it goes to the core analysis of Portfolio Wealth Global's research. What determines prices for stocks? Is it politics or is it supply and demand? Which is more important?
Well, I think in the short term, it's neither. It's fear and greed. There's a famous saying that in the short run, the stock market is a voting booth. In the long run, it's a scale. And what that really means is that in the short run, what you have is people that are tripping over themselves because they believe that the next great thing is happening, or they're just looking at a chart and it's going from the lower left to the upper right, and they're afraid that they're going to miss the next part of the upper right. So they buy it. The problem with that is that there's no real analysis going on in that kind of a thing. I mean, chart work and technical analysis is really just a matter of psychology. That's what you're measuring. And so that can go on for a long period of time. But ultimately, a corporation, if you look at what equity is, it's ownership. And so the price of equity should be a function of the actual free cash flow after all expenses are paid of that corporation over time. That's where the enterprise value should come from. That some of that enterprise value gets invested in plant and property, equipment, things like this. But at the end of the day, what's left is the value of the firm, right? I mean, that's how this works. And so if you don't reinvest, ultimately that value goes to zero because other people will, and they come along and they eat your lunch. So that's where this should be, but in the short term, it never is. And that's why you see the violent swings that we get sometimes in the market in both directions.
Now, Karl, speaking of our founder, Tom Beck, he's also the creator of the Portfolio Wealth Global newsletter. And for those who read it, they know he is a main contrarian of the gold sector. His analysis is that stocks were in a secular bear market for the past 11 years, actually from 2000 to 2011, while commodities were in a raging bull market. Now stocks have become a 20-year bull market, which we're halfway through, but a cyclical bear market, which will last for about 18 months at the beginning, which will not be severe. However, it may confuse many investors who will be selling their stocks about a decade too early. And yes, that is contrarian. He sees commodities as the best possibility for new positions as stocks head lower, but not yet. Now, Karl, Tom sees gold as heading to $1,430 by the end of this year. Is that accurate in your opinion, or is it optimistic, or is it conservative?
Well, I don't know. I certainly could see that price being a realistic number. I just don't see it as a very interesting opportunity. That's not a particularly large move compared against where gold sells today. So I guess that comes from being a CEO of a company that ran a 43% pre-tax operating margin. I don't look at things that someone thinks are going to move at 10% as being really all that interesting to me, especially when I don't have control. Especially when I don't have control over it. I mean, that's one of the problems with investing in anything is, you know, if you buy commodities or you buy stock or whatever, you are not in charge of your destiny, because, you know, unlike running a company where the decisions you make have a direct impact on the outcome, you don't have really any impact on the outcome unless you're moving enough of the market around to be able to actually cause price changes. And for 99% of the people out there, that's just not true.
Now, Karl, moving into healthcare, 51 million Americans are already in retirement. That number is going to grow to 75 million by the year 2035. And this is a massive elderly population. Professions that deal with medicine, healthcare, and treatment are on the rise. But how is it possible to fund Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security with lower taxes and 60% more beneficiaries than today?
Well, let's break this out, because you did what the media always does, and what
Lump
the
it together.
politicians always do too. You are in good company, and we know where you got it from. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are not the same thing. Social Security is funded with a 12.4% payroll tax from the first dollar up to the cap. And if you look at how the system is designed, it accumulates treasury bonds during times when there are a lot of people in the workforce compared to the number of retirees. And then it depletes those bonds when the opposite is true. That is not a flaw. That is not bankruptcy. That is the way the system was built. It was built that way on purpose. There's nothing wrong with spending those bonds, redeeming them as they come due with the Treasury, and using them to fund the payouts, because those payouts don't go on forever. The boomers that go through the system will die, and when they do, they will stop collecting. So that this is built into the system like this is not a substantial issue. And frankly, the adjustments that were made by the Grace Commission were good. That was in the 1980s when they changed some of the withholding caps. And there'll probably have to be another set of those, but it won't be very substantial. And that just is because the actuarial basis of the system, that is how long people live on average, does change a little bit, and very small changes in those projections make for big changes when you're compounding over the space of 30 or 40 years. So there are some adjustments that ultimately will need to be made to Social Security. Medicare and Medicaid are a different story entirely. That's where the entire problem is. And between those two programs, you have to remember Medicaid has about 38 to 40% of the funding comes from the states. It does not come from the federal government. It's a matching program where the federal government pays for part of it, the states pay for the rest. Between those two, it's about $1.6 trillion a year that's being spent today. 80% of that is being spent due to various things that, if we enforced antitrust law, which has been on the books for over 100 years, would not occur. If we were to take just one disease, type 2 diabetes, and instead of playing we're going to spend $400 billion a year on it, which is about what we do between those two programs, state and federal, and say the simple answer is this: you are not going to get any treatment unless you stop eating carbohydrates if you have type 2 diabetes. The vast majority of people who have the disease would have their blood sugar normalized, and all of the expensive things that go wrong, like having your feet cut off and going blind and kidney dialysis, all of that would not happen for those people. Now, there are some people for whom it would not work. Okay, I mean, that's the way medicine is, right? There is no magic bullet that works on everyone. But this is something that has been known since before there was insulin, because before we had insulin and these drugs, if you were diabetic and you did not stop eating carbohydrates, you died. There was no alternative. This was the only choice you had, was to don't do that. All of a sudden, we've turned medicine into a subscription model. So we now have the American Cancer Association, believe it or not, that says, we're not trying to cure cancer anymore. We're trying to make it a long-term survivable chronic disease like AIDS.
Wow.
Okay. We have the American Diabetes Association, same thing. Go ahead, eat all the pasta you want, eat all the bread you want, and then shoot yourself full of insulin to counteract it. Of course, the insulin costs a lot of money. If you didn't eat the bread, you wouldn't eat the insulin. They wouldn't make any money.
It's an industry.
Yeah, and this is and the same thing has happened. We've actually had Goldman Sachs out with a report very recently, in the last few days, that said hearing disease is actually bad business. And they pointed to the Gilead drug, Sovaldi, which is a cure for hepatitis C. Hepatitis C is a terrible disease. It's mostly passed either through sexual contact or through IV drug use. So if you don't sleep around a lot and you don't use IV drugs, your odds of getting it are very, very small. But if you get it, it eventually will destroy your liver. And without a liver, you don't live very long. So this, though, is not a treatment. It's an actual cure. In the United States, they were selling this for $90,000. In the rest of the world, in India, you can get that same drug for $900. And the problem is that because hepatitis C is transmissible, when you start curing people, the number of new patients you have that need the $90,000 treatment goes down. So the amount of money that Gilead made has been dropping precipitously every year as the number of patients that become sick decreases, okay? And yet, the only reason they made any billions of dollars in the first place was because they made it, the drug makers made it illegal for you to go to India, fill up your suitcase full of this stuff for $900, come back here in the United States and sell it, which would have made the price here in the United States $900 about a day and a half, right? So we now have a medical system that has given up on the idea of actually helping people. What they're doing is turning people into long-term addicts. We already have a model for this, by the way. It's called opioids. It's killing 60,000 Americans a year. But what the pharmaceutical and medical industry wants to do is come up with that model for every American so they can extract more money from you. And they want to do it with something that's not opioids, because the problem with opioids is you eventually, inevitably overdose and die. So if we do it with something like diabetes or cancer, you'll pay your $50,000 every year for the rest of your life, but the disease won't kill you. This is obviously a business model that cannot be sustained. It has driven medical costs from 4 to 5% of GDP in the 1950s and 60s to almost 20% today. It is compounding at an outrageous rate. And the Medicare system, when it was originally designed, was designed for medicine being about 4%, 5% of GDP. We are now spending 4 to 5 times as much. That there's no way for the system to survive. So that is where all the pressure is coming from, is from Medicare and Medicaid. And the only way to fix it is to break the monopolist backs of the medical industry, return that to 4 to 5% of GDP. That would be approximately an 80% reduction in that cost. So if you take $1.6 trillion and lop 80% off of that, we would be running a federal budget surplus today of about $700 billion.
Wow.
No more federal budget problems. And by the way, you would be getting mild deflation, which means your purchasing power as a consumer would go up every year because the federal debt would be going down, and that's the amount of money and credit in the system. And therefore, what do we know from basic economics? If there is less money chasing goods, the price in general goes down because the value of each dollar goes up. So you would now have, instead of having your money inflated away by the federal government's deficits, you'd have your purchasing power increase. So the common person in this country, they say, well, we had these tax cuts, right, which are supposed to improve everybody's standard of living. They did no such thing because the money that was given to you in tax cuts was taken away by increasing prices.
It's such a scam, Karl. I mean, it's on such a monumental level. Scam is such a, minimalistic word for what's actually happened.
Well, you think about, if you think about this in realistic terms, these people are stealing about $1.25 trillion, about $1,200 billion a year between all of this area within our economy, just from the federal and state governments alone, and about another $1 trillion from private industry and private citizens. So we are now talking about somewhere in excess, it's about 13, 14% of our GDP is literally being robbed. And, last time I checked, if I walked into a bank and said, any money, I went to jail.
Right. It has to be accountable. And not only are we incredibly financially being robbed, but the health of people that we love is being,
Well, I mean, that's part of the problem with this whole idea that we're just going to turn everything into a chronic condition, is that inevitably what that ends up being is that your health declines, your quality of life goes down the toilet. People talk about this with cancer, for example, and they say, well, we can extend your life by 2 years if you take this chemotherapy and this radiation, these drugs, right? What they don't mention is that you're going to spend, 3/4 of those last 2 years in a hospital bed. All right. Whereas if you don't do it, you will die 6 months earlier. But with the exception of the last couple of months, you'll probably be able to at least somewhat enjoy it. Okay. Now the last few months are going to stink no matter what. But what are we trading off here? And nobody is talking about this. No one. And what we have done, though, is since the crash, we've put about 30,000 people a month into the employment category, in the employed category, for so-called healthcare. 90% of them never provide a single second of care to an actual person at any time in their career. It's all overhead. It's billing support, it's coding, it's administrators. It's the same thing that's happening in our schools, where you have teachers screaming about how they're not getting paid well enough, but they're hiring 10 administrators for every teacher. And those people never teach a single second of math or social studies or English or anything to anyone. And the same thing is true in the medical field. If you fix this in the medical field, 90% of those people, because they're not doctors and nurses, they don't actually provide care, they'll get fired.
Wow. That equation is just, it's like, who did this?
The lobbyists and the Congress. They don't want to face the idea that we would have to go through a very deep recession, and we had to do it 20 years ago. I've been charting this and studying it and putting projections on it since the 1990s when I ran MCS, because I identified it as an existential threat to the company back when I was running the firm. And before I sold to Winstar, of course, my intention when I originally set it up was I was going to run it forever. I mean, that's what you do with a company, right? You don't, at least if you expect to build a sustainable business, what you're hoping is it's sustainable and that it goes on for, on a permanent basis. And what I kept looking at when I looked at the modeling I was doing in the economics was that eventually this was going to destroy the company no matter what I did. So the only solution to this is political. There isn't a business answer to this, because the protections that have been put in place through the political process.
You have such an amazing background financially. Your expertise is phenomenal. How did you get from working in the financial industries into an actual, what they call, one of the founders of the Tea Party? Could you explain?
Well, originally I was just a crazy programmer that was a wage slave for various people. And,
like all of us.
Yeah, that's the way it started. Actually, it's the first real job was this little garden variety place out in a Chicago suburb. I won't mention them because they're gone now. But then I started doing contract work and consulting and things like this. I worked for a couple of Fortune 50 companies and one firm that IPO'd in the late 1980s and early 90s. They went out of business. And when they went under, that's when I ultimately saw the opportunity with the internet as it was nascent, and turned that into an operating company. And that happened to be a very good choice, and it worked out really well. Started literally in my closet and ended up in 2 Prudential Plaza in downtown Chicago on the 26th floor.
I love that.
So yeah, it was a
little known secret, Karl.
Well, people talk about starting a business in their garage. Well, this one was literally in my closet, my bedroom. Okay, so I mean, sometimes it really does start that way. People are not always lying. But the thing that I think was interesting with the whole Tea Party movement was that I got dubbed that way because I had written an article on my blog and recommended that everyone, and this was right after Obama was elected, that everyone send a bag of tea to their senators and representatives. Non-threatening thing, there's no anthrax in there. It's a tea bag, right? And a couple of days later, Rick Santelli showed up on CNBC with a bunch of tea bags stapled all over the trading floor. And I don't know if he actually read my article or if he got it from somewhere else. I don't know how it spread.
Quite coincidental.
But that's how I got dubbed. And I gave a couple of speeches at some of the local events here and did a little traveling around Florida anyway on it. But it very quickly got co-opted into the guns, gays, and God thing. And that was a point at which I said, you know what, this was supposed to be about, T originally standing for taxed enough already. That's what the three letters stood for.
Oh, you're kidding me.
Yes, that's what it originally stood for, was taxed enough already. And of course, the allusion to Boston, the Boston Tea Party was there too. But that was the original acronym. And that disappeared very quickly as the various career politicians moved in and stole the movement, at which point I wrote several very scathing articles and literally put my middle finger up on the screen for people to look at and said, I'm done. So yeah, that's there's a lot of controversy over whether or not I was really part of the start of it, or I don't care. I don't want credit for it. I don't. It doesn't matter to me. What really disgusts me is what it turned into and how quickly.
Could you expound a little bit on your position there?
Well, the standard right-wing guns, gays, and God thing doesn't solve anything. Okay. The Second Amendment exists in this country as a guardian against tyranny. That's why it's here. Okay. You only need to look at what happened in Rwanda in 1994. People say, well, things like Nazi Germany can never happen again. Oh, really? In 1994, 1 million ethnic Rwandans were shoved into a hole in 100 days. And 15 years prior to that, they passed a law that disarmed the populace. Most of those who were killed in Rwanda, by the way, while our wonderful ex-President Clinton was in charge, who did absolutely nothing to stop it, even though it was all over the news and the fact that it was going on, most of them were killed with machetes and knives. If they had had some guns, that probably wouldn't have worked out so well for the people that were trying to do the killing. But this is what, this is the lesson. The problem we have today is that whenever you get some kind of movement going on politically, you get the professional agitators that come in, disrupt it, and replace it with the talking points from one side or the other of the aisle. And the original good idea goes away. It literally disappears overnight. The Occupy Wall Street thing was another attempt to try to bring some populist pressure on the bankers who, you just look at what Wells Fargo has done to people, first with home mortgages that were fraudulent, then with car loans, then with forced-placed home insurance, which wasn't necessary because they already had insurance. The amount of damage that was done to ordinary Americans by that one company is enormous, and nobody has ever been held to account. There's not one person who's gone to prison for it. Okay, but again, if I walked into one of their banks and stuck them up for $100, I'd go to jail. All right. But instead of being about that, it turned into this, we're going to make a social justice statement out of it. And, it gets all slippery and weird. And the next thing you know, nobody takes it seriously. And they shouldn't, because the value of it's been destroyed. Same thing happened with the Tea Party. Where is the so-called conservative caucus? Where is Mark Meadows and his band of merry men that were going to do all these wonderful things? Okay, there was absolutely nothing that has come out of any of that. And in fact, didn't the House of Representatives and the Senate just pass this huge budget with this great big deficit after they said they wouldn't do those kinds of things anymore? And guess who signed it? So yeah, the idea that there's actually some kind of movement there, the problem with them is they get co-opted very quickly, and that's what happened here.
Wow, that's very interesting. Now, Karl, is the rise of populism, both in Europe and the United States, is that a sign that governments will become even more intrusive? What do you think of that?
Well, sure, but you have to understand what causes it. It's fundamentally a demographic problem versus the promises you make that you can't fund. And the people in the government know this. So what did they do in Europe? They imported a bunch of people who were essentially refugees who had no skills. Okay, many of them are jihadists, as it turns out, which is not so good either. But half of those people that came into the European Union in the time that they've been there have never held a job. So you brought these people in supposedly to expand your economic base. And what do they do instead? They don't pay taxes, they take taxes. Okay, well, we do the same thing here. We supposedly reformed the welfare system and the immigration system in this country after Ronald Reagan gave amnesty to a whole bunch of illegal Mexicans who were here in the United States. And the promise was that we were going to slam the door, we weren't going to do that anymore. Well, that didn't happen. There are more illegal Mexicans in the country today than there were when Ronald Reagan made that pronouncement. And so now we got a new set of problems. We got DACA, we got all the stuff that goes on with this. But the problem ultimately comes down to this. You made promises you can't keep. So you're looking for economic growth at any price, and nobody's paying attention to the price part. Then the price becomes realized, and what do you get out of that? You get people like Donald Trump, because you had Barack Obama. Remember, his signature thing was that he was going to solve the healthcare crisis in this country, which at the time was very real. He didn't solve anything. It's worse today than it was then, okay? And it's exploded the deficit. We doubled the national debt in the years he was in office, and we did absolutely nothing to solve any of the problem because it got all siphoned off by the lobbyists and the pharmaceutical medical industry. They stole all the money. And well, eventually the people get tired of that and say, we've had it. We should learn from history, though. We should allow it to inform us, because in the 1930s, the same thing happened. And there's a little country called Germany that tried to run the same kind of social experiments in the Weimar Republic. And by the way, that was driven to some degree by the reparations that were forced from World War I. Okay, and what came from that was the election of this little man with a mustache. His name was Adolf Hitler. He did not show up with guns and take control in a coup. He was democratically elected to run that country. A lot of people don't remember that because they didn't bother to pay attention during high school when they were in history class.
I think that's part of the problem, is that people don't know history. People don't know history, and they don't even know why our Constitution is our Constitution.
They seem to forget that we had this little war a couple hundred years ago that started when the British Crown decided that the ordinary citizens could not own firearms and ammunition, and they went to Concord to try to seize that ammunition, and it didn't work out so good for them. We wouldn't be trying to repeat that sort of mistake, would we?
It's just amazing. Now, Karl, shifting gears just a little bit, the millennials are starting to hit peak earning years, and demographically, they're becoming largest in numbers, even bigger than the baby boomers generation. How is this impacting the trajectory of the United States?
Well, there's a couple of problems. An awful lot of those millennials are carrying around a lot of debt because we allowed the educational system to do the same kind of scam growth that we had within the healthcare system. So while they are hitting those peak earning years, they're coming into them with a background and a load that those generations before them did not have. So the accumulation of wealth that they're actually able to amass is much lower on a percentage basis in terms of the percentage of their earnings. In other words, they're having to service things that earlier generations did not with those earnings. That does not bode well for the future. What it does mean is that, at least in the immediate sense, there is a ability to try to pry the edges of the curve outward a little bit. And this again goes back to mathematics. When you add debt to the system and you start with GDP at a certain level of economic output, and you have less debt in the system than you have output, if you're growing the debt at a faster level than say you're growing the debt 4%, you're growing GDP at 2%. The first few years that you do this, it appears that you're actually benefiting everybody because the curve gets wider between those 2 points. GDP goes up more in dollar terms than debt goes up, and so the distance between the two lines increases. But that is an illusion because both of those are compound growth rates. And the problem with that is that a larger percentage compounded growth, no matter how small the original starts, will always outrun the shorter. It's just a matter of when it happens. And when you get to the point where those lines start to converge, that's where the social pressure starts. And so that's the problem you have with these policies, is that the politicians know this. They know they can sell this as essentially a free lunch to the masses. The people buy it mostly because they were asleep in high school and college. They didn't bother paying any attention to math class, and they think that they can have a free lunch, but there is no such thing.
I think they actually genuinely believe this.
Yeah,
They
they do.
march and they say, why shouldn't college be free? Why shouldn't this be free? Why should we demand free? And it's like, someone's got to pay for it.
Well, look, you
Don't you
know,
notice?
they did this in the Soviet Union, okay? You know, everyone was entitled to a stipend of this many loaves of bread, right? Which is fine, except for a problem arises. Who's going to bake the loaves, right? If I get the same number of loaves of bread, whether I go to work to bake the loaves or not, what incentive do I have to get up in the morning and go bake the loaves of bread? Well, eventually the government will say, we'll shoot you if you don't do it, right? Okay, so I go, but I work very poorly. And as a result, my productivity goes in the toilet. The productivity of the society as a whole goes in the toilet, because you can force me to show up, but you can't force me to be smart.
And eventually you literally have Venezuela. I mean,
Well, yeah, not just there. I mean, you look around the world, the Soviet Union collapsed for this exact reason. Okay, Venezuela collapsed for this. This is a repeating story throughout history. It happens every single time. And it's just human nature. People that don't have an incentive to get up and get to keep something, you know, they did a terrible thing with Obamacare, because the way the subsidies work, if you make about $25,000 a year, you essentially get free health care, because your health insurance, you have to buy it or else you get fined. But the subsidy means that it costs nothing. I'm able, if I make $25,000 a year, I can have a very nice health insurance plan for $15 a month. That is essentially zero, okay? If I make $40,000 a year, that subsidy is almost completely gone, and it costs me $900 a month. Well, figure that one out. 12 times 9 is about $8,000, right? So that's an almost 50% marginal tax rate on that next $20,000 of income. So if I can live on $24,000, why would I make 50? I have to give half of what I make to the government. That's crazy. All right. Well, what do you think I'm doing right now? I'm writing some articles. I run some advertising on my blog, and when I get to a point that, okay, this is how much I'm going to make in a year, I turn the advertising off. I don't make any more money on purpose.
Exactly. Exactly. If you're not gonna get paid, nobody's gonna work. And if it's everything's for free, why should anyone work? And if you're gonna get penalized for working,
why would you go to work?
Why would you go to work?
Yeah.
Right. It's just insane. And then you have literally Venezuela. They need to show those kids, Venezuela, do you want this? You know?
Well, yeah, remember in Venezuela, they're literally eating the neighbor's dog.
It's so horrendous, and it's happening right now. It's terrifying.
It's right now in your face. They are literally, if you have a dog, you better make sure it's inside.
It's just tragic. Anyway, Karl, shifting gears just a little bit, do you think that it is prudent for Americans to retire abroad in countries where that is less expensive to live?
How much money do you have? I guess that would be the qualifying question. You have, and the reason I say that is just leaving on a visitor kind of basis, okay, or not as a citizen, okay, is probably not all that wise, because your assets are still here in the United States and can still be confiscated, either inflated away or taken outright. Getting citizenship in another country is not a particularly trivial process. The United States is one of the easier places to do it. Most other nations want to see anywhere from several $100,000 to a couple of $1 million worth of investment in their economy on a permanent basis in order to give you permanent residency or citizenship. And if you do that, and then you get all your assets out of the U.S. so that whatever bad happens here can't get you, then you have to be very sure that whatever we start here when we come apart isn't going to infect there. Because if it does, and the local citizens figure out that, hey, the ugly American over there was part of the reason that our economy blew up, that could be pretty bad. They might hold a barbecue in your honor.
Exactly. You are the roasting guest. Oh my God. Now, shifting gears into the Federal Reserve. On one hand, they cannot raise interest rates too much, since borrowing costs would be detrimental. But on the flip side, lowering interest rates, again, would create chaos. So, Karl, in your opinion, where do you see bond yields going, and how would this affect the stock market?
I'll give you two scenarios, because I'm not sure which one we're going to get first, but I'm very sure it's one of the two. The first is that the yield curve flattens and essentially flat lines. But you have to remember how we got to where we are now with the stock price, with the stock market going on the S&P 500 of about 1,000 in the 1980s to the 2,600 today. The Dow, has gone up commensurately as well. I'm sorry, it was a little over 100. So I mean, this is a huge increase. But what's happened is that interest rates have gone from double digits down to 1%, 1.5% for very good AAA corporate credit. So if you borrow $1 million at a 10% interest rate, you need $100,000 worth of money in order to pay the interest on that bond every year. And then rates, if they go to 5%, you only need $50,000 to pay the interest on that $1 million, because that's, the interest rates come down by half. But since you have $100,000 in cash flow, the other thing you can do is borrow another $1 million. So eventually you end up with rates at 1%, and you don't have $1 million out, you have $10 million out. Okay, and for the same $100,000. Well, this is what's happened, and this turning of the leverage crank is why the stock market has gone up. It's also why not just corporate borrowing, but government borrowing in all forms has gone to the moon as well, because the cost of keeping that money out has gone down, and instead of paying less interest, what corporations and governments have done is borrow more with the same coupon payments. That is now over, because rates can't materially go down much more, even they've come up a little bit, but even if they were go back near zero, it would not change this. Okay, so the ability to turn this crank further has ended. That is what has driven valuations. That is responsible for essentially all of it. So that's a problem. If you're looking for prices on a multiple basis to advance dramatically, you've got a little problem trying to figure out where that's going to come from, because you can't crank the leverage up any further. The malignant situation is that because of the government budget deficits, the cost of borrowing goes up whether the Federal Reserve likes it or not. And the reason for that is at some point people start wondering whether or not they're ever going to get their money back from Uncle Sam. And at that point, they start pricing in the cost of borrowing, just like if you're a subprime car buyer, you're going to pay 18% interest. But if you're a good car buyer and you have good credit, you'll pay 5%. Okay. Well, if that starts happening here, then the squeeze is on, because remember that all corporate credit is predicated upon the risk-free rate. Why would I give my money to Apple if I can get the same interest rate from the government with no risk? The answer is I would not. So Apple will have to pay a little bit higher rate in order to get me to give them their money. And now their leverage comes out and their stock price collapses. So this is, if we get a substantial move upward, and by the way, essentially nobody in the investment world has lived in anything other than a secular declining rate market, because it's been going on now since the 1980s.
Right.
Okay, so this is now
no experience with anything else.
Almost 40 years, which is essentially the entire career of everyone currently in the market advisory and analysis role. There is no one left, with the exception of people like Art Cashin. Okay, there's a handful of people that are still around, but virtually nobody that that was in the market at those times during previous cycles. So this cycle will end. It has ended now from a standpoint of ever lower rates. Now the question is, do we get the benign or the malignant outcome? But either way, it does not bode well for asset prices. In one case, you have essentially flat asset prices, and in the other case, you have a collapse in asset prices.
Wow. What do you think is going to happen?
I think we get the collapse, because I don't think the government's going to take on the medical problem. And if they don't solve the budget issue fairly soon, we're going to start to see that ratchet higher. And again, it's just a matter of compounding. If you take, $1.6 trillion a year worth of this spending, and it goes up at 8%, well, it goes up at 8%. Well, it doesn't sound so bad. That's only this much this year. The problem is it's 8% on 8% the next year. And that's what's been going on now for the last several decades. We went from a couple hundred billion worth of expenditures between Medicare and Medicaid. Now it's $1.6 trillion. How long does this go on before the interest expense is greater than all the tax revenue? And that's the point at which it ends, whether you like it or not, because then nobody is ever going to get paid, and they know it. The reality is you'll never get there. The market never lets you actually hit the wall. It didn't in 2007 and 2008. Remember, 2007, 2008 was all about a couple little hedge funds that blew up, and then Bear Stearns, and then all of a sudden, hey, wait a minute, Lehman doesn't have any money. Okay, and so, but that's the way it happens, is that people realize that although this company is functioning and has cash flow, they are factually bankrupt. Okay, and that same recognition can happen on a national scale, and it's already happening with the states and the pension funds in some of the cities. And so it's just a matter of time before we either fix this or this happens to us on a national basis.
Karl, how can we fix this? What's your perspective?
You throw people in prison, a lot of them. You have to break the medical monopolies. You have to collapse the cost of medical care by about 80%. That is not impossible. It is a very doable thing. It will result in an extremely severe economic downturn for a short period of time. Probably about 15% in GDP contraction, which would formally be called a depression because the threshold is 10. But we have a model for this. It's 1920-21, when after World War I, there was a lot of overproduction. A lot of people got in trouble. They took on a lot of leverage. Debt costs came down. Interest rates went down. The collapse started, and the Federal Reserve raised rates and pulled system liquidity out, and all the people who had gotten in over their heads all went bankrupt at once. It was the largest and most severe economic downturn in terms of GDP in American history. It was, however, followed, by the way, they called it GNP then, they computed it differently, but it was followed by the largest expansion in industrial production ever recorded in America. Within 18 months, we were back to full employment. So, and the reason it happens is quite simple. In 2008 and 2009, all those banks that were bankrupt, the Wachovias, the Wells Fargos, even the JP Morgans, although actually JP Morgan might have been the exception. They probably were solvent, but not by a lot. But all the others, if all those banks in your town had gone out of business, do you really think there wouldn't have been any banks? Or do you think somebody would have bought the bank building for 10 cents on the dollar and opened another bank tomorrow? Okay, well, if I get the bank building for 10 cents on the dollar, my cost of operating is lower than the guy who had it before. That's good for you, right? That's good for everybody in the economy except the guy who went bankrupt. But that's how this is supposed to work. And so we can fix this, but politically it's almost impossible because you're talking about firing probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 million people.
Wow. So it's tough, but there is a solution. It's just going to be really hard.
There's a solution if we take it before the spiral starts. Once we get into the point that we cannot cover the operating expenses with tax revenues, it becomes almost impossible because the more you cut, the worse the problem gets in the short term. Remember that as those people become unemployed, what do? They go on welfare, food stamps, and so the deficit actually in the short term expands. You have to be able to absorb that long enough to get through it, or you get a federal government collapse.
Now, that leads me to my next question. Now, Karl, what are the best ways to build wealth in today's America, the way we sit right now?
Right now, you sit on things that can immediately be convertible into cash and cannot be devalued. So you don't want to own stocks that can all of a sudden lose half their value. That would be bad. Because when the next major dislocation event comes, and there will be one, you want to buy things cheap. There were an awful lot of people that became very wealthy during the Depression. They didn't get that way during the Depression. They got that way when we came out of the Depression. And they got that way by buying things very cheaply that people had to puke up during the Depression because they went broke. The same thing happened. As part of the reason that I was able to build a successful internet business was I was able to capitalize on other organizations that went under during a brief recession in the early 1990s and pick up equipment. And in fact, we got our office space in 2 Prudential Plaza for about 30% of the going rate for Class A office space because the company that was in there before went under. And they had a lease and it was empty. And the building was in danger of violating their covenants with their lenders. And so they were willing to let us have the space at a very low price in order to be filled beyond their level that their covenants said that they had to have. And so we had AAA office space in downtown Chicago for $8 a square foot.
Wow.
The going rate was 40.
So there is money to be made through this.
Absolutely. And you know, when you pay $8 a square foot for office space and the guy, your competitor paid 25 or 30, well, gee, that makes it easy to make money, right?
Karl, it has been an honor to have you on this show. How can everyone follow your work?
Market-ticker.org is where I write pretty much on a daily basis. There's usually a couple articles up there. And there's also a book I wrote in 2011 called Leverage that was published by Wiley. You can find links to acquire that if you'd like. Again, it's 2011, so it's a few years back. However, not really a whole lot has changed.
Karl, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me on.
Mr. Karl Denninger, expert in financial analysis, award-winning journalist, businessman, political activist, and the voice behind the market ticker. For the Industry Experts Panel, I'm Michelle Holliday at PortfolioWealthGlobal.com.